Hi, and welcome to the Environmental Unit Training. This training is intended to provide you with a brief overview of the multiple responsibilities that you'll have within the Environmental Unit, with a focus on response to oil spills. My name's Elliott Taylor. I'm a principal with Polaris Applied Sciences within my office based over here on Bainbridge Island in the state of Washington. This brief introductory course should give you a good idea of some of the challenges that the environmental unit faces when having to respond to a spill. The key components of a response obviously entail safety. That's going to be paramount for both the responders and the public. But then we also want to immediately be able to focus on some of the environmental concerns and issues around that spill. The whole point of responding quickly and effectively to a spill is to minimize those potential hazards to human health and to the environment. And within the environmental unit, that is our job, is to really focus on those concerns that we will be facing during the response. As part of the planning section, our job is to think about this and get ahead of the response itself. So what is the environmental unit? This is that section within the organization, and usually we're talking about an incident management system or an incident command system, where we pull together the expertise to define the critical components needed to be aware of and plan for in a response. We want to characterize what is happening with the spill. Where is that spilled oil going? How is it traveling? What resources are being put at risk of contact with the spill? We want to identify priorities for protection and cleanup so that we can keep the highly sensitive areas protected and then clean up as quickly as possible those areas that have oil on them. And in doing this, we need to make sure that we've engaged in the planning process and that we have engaged the stakeholders that need to be a part of this response. And understand their concerns and issues and include consideration of those components into the response itself. The environmental unit is working within a program. As I said, we're part of this incident management system. So we sit in this position where we're looking and guiding operations. We're working with incident command and their objectives, trying to make sure that everything that is going forward with the planning process is responsive to Unified Command or Incident Command's objectives and giving operations the right tools that they need in order to conduct an effective response. So in the organization, when we think about the Incident Command system, we have the command group. Within the command group, we then have the key four sections: operations, logistics, finance, and then planning. And the planning section is the one that's always working on what the situation is, understanding what the situation is, but then getting ahead of the situation. And in that regard, we need to be aware of the environmental unit, and that is the organization that sits within the planning section. And then within the environmental unit, we can have a whole series of different considerations and levels of expertise required. Usually within the environmental unit, we're going to see a lot of technical experts as well as specialists from government agencies and local representation that are aware and work with the sensitivities in a particular area. So the environmental unit's responsibilities really are to think about how we can undertake the response in a way that provides for the best environmental recovery, to minimize the impacts, minimize potential effects of the spill, minimize the potential adverse effects of the response itself. And in doing so, what we have to do is be aware of spill movement. Where is it going? How is it tracking? How is it changing? What are the characteristics of that spill? Understand that oil changes through time, and so the properties will potentially affect how we're going to respond and how we're going to clean that oil up. We need to ensure we understand what the sensitive resources are. We don't necessarily have the same sensitive resources in an area at all times of the year. We may have areas with bird rafting at certain times of the year, and other times of the year they're not there, or herring spawning, or turtles using beaches. So we need to be aware of the sensitivities, but also the timing of those sensitivities relative to the event that we're working with. And then the environmental unit also needs to be aware of what permitting and considerations and plans need to be developed specifically for different aspects of the response, such as how are we going to manage waste? Are we going to be able to decant? Are we going to use some alternative technologies? These are all part of the EU responsibilities. So if we think about the environmental unit and being activated, there are some basic priorities that we need to ensure. And again, the environmental unit leader will undertake these. Of course, it is the planning section chief that should be identifying and triggering the need for an environmental unit. And on being triggered, one of the first things we'll do is really look for the sensitive areas so we can try to protect the critical areas as quickly as possible. We need to consult with the natural resource trustees and have their input on those sensitivities, as well as wildlife in the area and where that might be located. And then we need to, again, understand and predict what is happening with the oil. How is it changing and where is it moving over time? So we can get operations to the right place before oil contacts it, ideally. So we're looking at weather forecasts, understanding how that's going to affect things, how that might affect sea state conditions, and all of those, of course, have to do with how oil is changing as well. We need to monitor the response, make sure that the response is effective and that we're not causing any adverse effects from the response techniques that are being used. We're going to be looking at oil on shorelines and identifying where priority areas for cleanup are going to be and how to best clean those areas up. And then, of course, the consultation process with those agencies that can inform us about wildlife or inform us about endangered species or marine mammals or any other critical resources that might be at risk. So these are all part of the environmental unit considerations. We need to think about potential historical or cultural resources that might be at risk. And this is very often where we have to reach out to specialists that have historical properties, information, or cultural resources that might be at risk. The environmental unit needs to think about alternative response technologies. Are we going to use dispersants or shoreline cleaners, and if so, under what conditions, and how is that providing a true benefit or a net benefit relative to other options? We have to develop a waste management plan and disposal plans, sampling plans. In doing all of this, of course, we have to be providing information to the planning section. We need to be providing information to the Unified Command and to the Joint Information Center. And a key, as mentioned before, is making sure that we engage with the wildlife branch. They know where the resources at risk are at a particular time of year. They can help us with that. And that'll be an important part of the process of the natural resource damage assessment or impact assessment that will be taking place in parallel with the response. And like everyone, the environmental unit has a unit log, the ICS 214, which is just a record of different activities, different events as they unfold over the course of the response. So the environmental unit leader, this is the person that leads that group and is in charge of that group. That's the person that will undertake and guide us through that whole process that we just went through. Generally, that can be somebody from the responsible party, but here in the U.S., on the West Coast in particular, that environmental unit lead, per the area contingency plans, will be somebody from a trustee agency. So it can be Department of Ecology in Washington, or somebody from CalOSPR down in California. So it's that being said, the RP will and needs to be engaged with the environmental unit. So you may take on the role of a deputy environmental unit leader. And sometimes we can look at the other options For certain cases, we just simply may have a scientific support coordinator, the SSC, that can fill that role of the environmental unit leader, or it can just simply be whoever is in charge of the planning section or a deputy planning section if it's a small incident and doesn't really require a lot of staff. For large incidents, though, the environmental unit leader is going to be actually dealing with a lot of tasks. And one of those is going to be providing information into the planning process and all the meetings that go on with that planning process. So for any significant spill that's going to entail a fair amount of work, you really should have a deputy environmental unit leader. That person stays with the unit, ensures that the unit log is kept to date, and can keep track of all the different components of activities within the environmental unit. And then make sure that the critical information is being provided to the environmental unit leader as they go into meetings, and in turn get debriefed from the environmental unit leader for other assignments or other requirements that are needed of the environmental unit itself. There are quite a few different technical specialists that might be considered for a response, depending on the situation. Not every spill is going to require all of these, just like not every situation may require a deputy environmental unit leader. But if we look at sort of the range of likely ones, particularly for spills in a marine environment, we're looking at resources at risk specialist, somebody who understands response technologies and alternative technologies such as dispersants or burning, trajectory analysis specialist, the weather person, somebody who is a specialist on shoreline cleanup, that technique and SCAT, the historical and cultural resource specialists, somebody that specializes in waste management and disposal, and then sampling specialists. So there are a number of different contributors that we'll be reaching out to be a part of this environmental unit. And again, keep in mind that in a significant spill, particularly here in the U.S., we will have a scientific support coordinator that is providing direct support to the federal on-scene coordinator, so the U.S. Coast Guard, for instance. And then that person will contribute most likely to the environmental unit itself. And they also can reach out and help with the environmental unit's responsibilities in terms of trajectories, resources at risks, mass balances, overflights, etc. And importantly, the SSC will also be a key voice in informing Unified Command, and particularly the FOSC, on some of the alternative countermeasures and the trade-offs that are associated with those. So this can be a very valuable person to have, very much in line and in tune with what is being developed within the environmental unit, and a resource that can help with a lot of those responsibilities. Again, the people that we're looking at in the environmental unit really are personnel. So you're talking about your technical specialists, resource agency personnel, consultants. You have a lot of other resources, and this is really what a good environmental unit and the people that come into that unit understand is a lot of plans, a lot of guidance manuals, a lot of mapping that may be already available that you will need to use and consult. So you have the area contingency plans, you have regional contingency plans, you may have local plans, whether those are facility plans or others. And then in many places, particularly, we see more and more geographic response plans or geographic response strategies, which are very detailed and provide good information on resources at risk. And of course, you need to have your response manuals and handbooks and your job aids, your checklist. So you can have your the incident management handbook, you can have your personalized handbook, but they help you step through and understand and make sure that you're staying on task within that environmental unit. So these are just a couple examples. Again, you have the incident management handbook from the Coast Guard, or other guidance manuals such as the Incident Command System manual that is prepared here in the state of Washington. Very valuable. Well, let's go through some of the specialists that are going to be at play potentially within the environmental unit, and what their responsibilities basically boil down to. We'll start off with the resources at risk specialist. So this is a person that's looking at where oil is moving, how it's tracking, and what resources, what sensitivities are out there that may be contacted by that oil. So you're going to be looking to prioritize and locate specifically where there's sensitive habitats, sensitive cultural resources, or socioeconomic resources. And usually we're going to start to develop what is called the ICS 232, your environmental sensitive information, so that everyone in the response can be very aware of what the priority sensitivities are, and operations in particular can look at how those can be protected. And we want to be able to track continuously how things are changing with oil movement and distribution, understanding that operations is trying to contain things and keep oil from certain areas, but also to monitor what the possible effects of our response are on those resources. If we have good mapping, if we have good sensitive area information such as the GRPs, then we have a lot of that information already readily available. But what does that information capture? Well, it captures the sensitive areas. So that can be anything like water intakes, birds, fishing areas, seagrass beds, you name it. But that is really what we're looking for. And whether it's in the GRPs or whether it's on maps or in some atlas, that's really the tool that you want to have available to you. Here in the state of Washington, we have the GRPs. We have very detailed maps that provide a good indication of what priority areas are relative to potential spill locations. In other places around the world, you may have sensitivity mapping. Again, these are complements to the environmental unit to help you understand where the response needs to focus given the movement of that oil. Amongst other things, when we think about spills and sensitive areas, we have to be aware that sensitive areas include socioeconomic and human use. As you can see behind me, anything like a marina or places where ferries are coming to and fro are places where a spill could represent a significant impact to just simply human use activities, tourism, and recreation. Some of the sensitivities we need to think about might be on a map. We may have environmental sensitivity indices that say we have a sand beach or we have a sand flat. So those are informative to a certain extent, but what's the use of those areas? Are there clams out here? Is this a harvesting area? Whether it's for traditional use or for commercial use, those also need to be identified. And if we're going to protect them, how are we going to protect them? Can we put boom in a certain location here that will keep oil off of these shorelines, away from these sensitive areas? So another sensitivity we need to think about are some of the back bays, small estuaries, inlets, ways in which a rising tide or a high tide may be able to flood into these areas and carry oil into some of the most sensitive locations where we have quiet waters, we have spawning, we have vegetation, and a lot of wildlife, birds in particular. And so think about, are there already strategies and tactics about how you might be able to protect these areas? Can you put boom in place, or is there a weir that it can be taken advantage of to exclude the oil from these back bays? Another specialist is the response technology specialist. So this is the person that's looking at and weighing the benefits and possible options of combining different strategies and tactics. So very often when we're looking at a spill, we're thinking about mechanical systems, boom and skimmers. But in some cases, we need to think about what other options are there. Are there areas that we want to consider for dispersant use? Are there areas where burning off the oil might be advantageous? Are there areas on the shoreline where we want to use cleaners or help with bioremediation? So these alternative technologies require somebody who understands those and can understand under what conditions they would be used, are they appropriate, and what are the benefits obtained by using those relative to either nature itself or to mechanical response systems. Usually the response technology specialists will work on this process in consultation with other members of the environmental unit, looking at the potential trade-offs and sensitivities, and ultimately the decision, though, goes to the command, the incident command or unified command, and here in the U.S. it'll go to a regional response team for approval. In all of this, of course, there's a time element. Some of these techniques need to be decided upon early, and you have to have an approval in a relatively quick manner to be able to implement them in the window of opportunity. So here, for instance, it's common that we have areas identified as potential areas for use of dispersants, as an example. We have areas where they're approved, you can use them, that's in the offshore zones, but outside of the park. Or there are areas where it's conditional. So you have to go through a process, a checklist, to verify that you meet certain requirements, certain conditions, and you understand what the trade-offs are. And then there are other areas that are simply just off limits. So a good plan will identify where these are optional, where these are approved, or where these are off the table. And then the environmental unit is charged with really clearly identifying under what circumstances those options are going to be used, and initiate the process for incident command approval to operations to implement those alternative response technologies. In a similar way, if we're going to think about possible burning, we have to go through a similar process. There may be areas that are off limits, some that may be conditional, some that are okay. And again, it'll be the environmental unit that has to go through, identify that the conditions are suitable for this strategy, and that we have the tools to implement it, we have the tactical resources, and that we can do so in a timely manner, and initiate the process to get that approval out so that operations can implement it under the conditions defined and in the right locations. All of this really comes down to trade-offs, and when we think about trade-offs, there's two concepts that are typically used. One is a net environmental benefit, or NEBA, analysis. What are the trade-offs and the benefits for the environment? The other one is the spill impact mitigation analysis. They're similar. The difference being, particularly with SEMA, is that we are looking beyond just the environmental factors, but we could be considering socioeconomic factors, and we can be considering cultural resource considerations. So in this discussion and in this analysis of looking at the trade-offs, we're looking at what are the benefits, what are the drawbacks, do we have the right time? We want to gauge those alternatives relative to no response or monitoring only, or just simply mechanical response. And we need to think of the various portions of the area that will be used in different aspects of the environmental realm: water surface, water column, shorelines, habitats. So this is a job that typically will require that coordinated effort on behalf of trustees and the responsible party within the environmental unit. When we think about net environmental benefit, or SEMA, there are some very good guidance documents that can help us with that process. There's a series that's put out by the IPCA, API, and the OGP on both of these topics. And so these are good resources to look up if you haven't. Just go in under IPCA and oil spill response, and you can get access to a lot of the guides. But this is something that those working in the environmental unit hopefully already have a very good understanding of. When we think about that consultation process and we're looking at the response options, whether there's protection or on-water response options or whether there's shoreline cleanup options, we have to be aware that the EU is the center for that consultation process. So we're looking at what are the implications of what we're proposing to do for operations relative to wildlife and endangered species. We're looking at what those implications are for perhaps cultural resources or historical resources. So we need to engage with those specialists, whether they're at the federal level, a state level, local level, and indigenous level. And this is something where the environmental unit has to ensure that we can pull those individuals together and get that consultation included as part of our series of recommendations for operations. Another technical specialist is a trajectory analysis and weather specialist. So this is the person or group that will be looking at and understanding where oil is moving, how it's changing, what the weather patterns are, what the weather changes are, those implications and the forecasts that are important to operations as well as to changing and movement of oil. We would like to have an idea of where oil will be in the next 12 hours, 24 hours, 48 hours, so that we can always be thinking ahead of where things are going and try to have a plan developed for those areas. Can we protect resources that might be contacted by that oil if we are unable to contain it on water, for instance? A lot of our information on trajectories really needs to also be aware of and include overflight information or observations from the field. If we know where the oil is going, that needs to inform the modeling that is used for trajectory analysis. Likewise, if we are observing changes of behavior of that oil, that needs to be fed back also to those that are doing the modeling and predicting how those changes are happening. If we see the oil emulsifying, picking up a lot of water, but the model doesn't tell us that it's emulsifying, we need to inform those that are responsible for forecasting changes of those changes that we're seeing in the field. The overflight information will tell us where we see oil on the water surface, and that information should match up with the trajectories. The shoreline cleanup assessment technique, or SCAT specialist, is another person that will be very much engaged in the environmental unit. This is the individual or the group that would be looking at segmenting the shorelines, identifying those areas that where oil has reached the shoreline, to what degree the shorelines are oiled. They'll be making recommendations on how to best treat that oil, how to best clean it up, and to what degree. They're going to be looking at, through their teams deployed in the field, they'll be looking at sensitivities in the area. They'll be looking at those resources that might be at risk of oiling, but also those that might be at risk from the cleanup operations themselves. And ultimately, this group will be responsible for identifying and inspecting the shorelines after cleanup to say enough has been done, or that we've reached the target set for cleanup operations in the field. And this is an important information source too that will also be included in what the situation is. The SCAT teams that are in the field are identifying where oiling is and the degree of oiling. That often is coming back to the command post in a form of maps that are generated through that SCAT team or the shoreline team to identify key areas with highest degree of oiling. That helps focus operations into those areas, particularly if there are sensitivities there and there's a potential for oil remobilization. A lot of photography, a lot of video, a lot of documentation of those conditions in the nearshore and on the shorelines will come from this particular group. So there'll be a lot of data management that goes into the process for the environmental unit from this particular group as well. Another group of specialists will be the disposal and waste management specialists. So these will include considerations for how oil is being managed, what processes are being used to minimize the amount of waste generated, They'll be looking at things such as options to decant oil. If we have a lot of water, can we decant some of that water back into, say, a boomed area and minimize what we're keeping in tankage? Where can we store stuff temporarily? How is it going to be transported to longer term facilities? And ultimately, how is it going to be disposed of? Very importantly, tracking the waste and tracking what is recovered and where it's going is a key part of this this particular group as well. So we'll be reaching out very early in the response to make sure that we have a waste management specialist as quickly as possible on scene to forecast and direct and help direct operations in handling these materials. So typically a plan will be developed that's very specific to the incident on where those wastes are going to be stored, how they're going to be handled, best techniques, best recommendations for minimizing that waste volume, and where it's going to go for disposal. We have another technical specialist, which is the historical cultural resource specialist. Again, this is somebody who's really specifically looking at the endangered species, or they're looking at the cultural resources, identifying where those are a particular issue. Sometimes this information is sensitive, so it's not readily available in public documents. That's where having this resource available to the environmental unit is so important, because they may be working not only at the time of the response, guiding and identifying constraints for activities in the field, but they may be required to go out and simply obtain information. It's not unlikely in many cases where sites that were unknown have been identified during a response from cultural resource specialists or archaeologists that work in the field at the time of the response to identify some of these sensitive areas that were previously unknown. So it is something that needs to be considered, particularly in the more remote areas where we don't know of the sensitivities. A sampling specialist is also somebody that's going to be very valuable to us. That sampling specialist can be sampling oil, it can be sampling air, can be sampling sediments, water. So there's a lot of different components for the sampling. And air sampling is particularly important, working hand in hand with safety to make sure that we're protective of the potential human health concerns around inhalation in particular. And so that's something that we'll be looking at with safety right away, having an air monitoring specialist working with them. The other component of the sampling is really looking at do we have samples of the source oil? Do we know how it's changing? Have we sampled background areas? What kind of analysis are being done? Where exactly are we taking those samples? How frequently are we taking, and what are we analyzing for? These are all important in considerations of evidence, where the oil changes, the effects, and how that might affect resources at risk, tracking oil and other potential pollutants in an area. It ultimately plays into issues such as legal claims and legal defense. So these are important considerations for the sampling specialists, identifying where those samples are being taken, what the objective of those samples are, and how the results of the sampling and analysis are going to be used. So in summary, there's a lot of different aspects that really fall to the environmental unit. Clearly, as soon as we come on scene, we have to start identifying how many of these different possible components of the environmental unit need to be considered, and how are we going to organize our unit, and who's going to be able to come in and work with us to address these multiple issues if they are required of the response. Most importantly, understanding and staying ahead of what is happening in the field is important. So understanding, predicting where the oil's moving, how it may be affecting resources, how we can best protect those resources and mitigate the effects of the spill are ultimately what we need to be very much focused on. Think about the priorities for protection, help guide cleanup and completion targets, And above all, make sure that all of this is being done through a proper planning and engagement with stakeholders and going through that consultation process. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed this class, this brief overview of the environmental unit. If you'd like further information on the environmental unit, please feel free to join us online for our next module, which speaks to the environmental unit and the incident command system. You can find that online at our website. And of course, if you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to myself, to Andy Graham, or to our Polaris website, where you find more information and where we'd be happy to have a conversation with you. Thank you.